Welcome back. I'm Max Bergman, Director of the Stewart Center and Europe-Russia-Eurasia program at CSIS.
And I'm Maria Snegovaya, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia.
And you're listening to Russian Roulette, a podcast discussing all things Russia and Eurasia from the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Collisions: The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. This is the title of the latest and obviously very timely book by Professor Michael Kimmage. My name is Maria Snegovaya, and it is my pleasure to be joined today by Dr. Kimmage and Professor Elise Sarotte to discuss Michael's book and the implications of his findings for our understanding of the war in Ukraine. Michael Kimmage is a Senior Associate Non-Resident Fellow here at CSIS, in addition to serving as Chair of the Department of History at Catholic University. Elise Sarotte is the Marie Jose and Henry Kravis Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She is most recently the author of Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of the Post-Cold War Stalemate. Obviously, both books extremely timely, but our main focus today is on collisions. Michael and Mary, thank you both for joining us today, and let's jump right in. Michael, obviously, let's start with you. Please begin with how you decided to write this book, and obviously I would love you to sum up, if possible, some of your text's main arguments.
First of all, thank you so much, Maria, for hosting, and thank you so much, Mary, for joining. Thank you so much to CSIS for hosting as well. I'm proud of all of my book's blurbs, but I'm especially proud to have a blurb from Professor Mary Sarotte, whose scholarship on these topics is simply foundational and the point of departure for any of us who try to work in this domain. So it's both a pleasure and an honor to be with both of you today. I wrote the book as an early attempt to do a history, not of the war itself, but of the origins of the war, acknowledging that there are lots of ways in which this is hard to do at the moment. Of course, the war is not over. And more importantly, I think for those of us of a scholarly bent, there's just a lot of information, evidence, data, memoir literature, archival material that we don't yet have and won't have for a long time. So that's a constraint. It's a limitation. But it did feel to me good to start in early on the work of historical analysis, because I think historical analysis gets us behind the headlines. And we live with all kinds of pressing news about many issues, but certainly about the war. And I think at times that gets us away from the work of contextualizing what's happening. If we can't contextualize what's happening, I don't think that we can come up with good policy for the present moment and the future. And so much as I would wish to, sort of educate my readers to the extent that I can, it's the policy aspect of it that also matters greatly to me with this book, and trying to make history contribute to sound and good policy formation is sort of my highest ambition for the book. The book sketches 4 causes of the war in Ukraine. I'll just mention each briefly at the moment. The first is very simple, but not to be overlooked. And this is a long-standing, not recent, but long-standing Russian desire to control the territory and geopolitical destiny of Ukraine. And this is embedded in quite a lot of history. We could take it back to the 1990s and before, but it's certainly not something that Putin discovered in 2021 or 2022. Secondly, there are the vulnerabilities of Ukraine after 1991, of a country that has a large population, a large landmass, but that was economically often in difficult conditions after 1991. And that was not a part of any security alliance after 1991, which is a difficult place to be, given the first point that I mentioned, the regional ambitions of Ukraine's neighbor to the east. Third is a form of lackadaisical, lazy, ineffective diplomacy, for which I think Europe and the United States are equally to blame. And that takes us not back to 2021, but to 2014 and to the Maidan Revolution, annexation of Crimea, and Russian incursion into eastern Ukraine, or the Donbass. And then finally, and this in a sense connects very directly to the work that Mary has done, I don't argue, and I don't think that Mary's scholarship points us in this direction, but it raises the question. I don't argue that NATO enlargement or NATO expansion is the cause of the 2022 war. I argue almost the opposite of that, that a Russian perception of American weakness, fickleness, internal difficulties, etc., also played a role in Putin's decision to wage war as he did in February of 2022. So in that sense, this is a raging debate among many experts and scholars, and I think I come down on a spot that's sort of acknowledges the importance of NATO, but puts something very different in the place of NATO enlargement and NATO expansion as a cause of the war.
Thanks a lot, Michael. And I think it's a fantastic way also to Mary. I'd love to turn to you, Mary, for your thoughts, right? Obviously, since Michael pointed out, as he pointed out, you've made a lot of related, you worked a lot on this related topic. So maybe you can provide your thoughts, first of all, on Michael's argument, and second, how this argument fits your own analysis of the NATO expansion.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to come talk about your wonderful book. Second, I'd like to say everyone should buy the book. Since this is online, everyone can do this while they're sitting here on the Zoom, which is great. Yeah, Michael and I have been in dialogue for a long time about these issues, and it's great to see it finally come out in book form. And I particularly like the framing of the book as a understanding the war as having multiple layers. I think he's absolutely right about that. So you have the war of Russia and Ukraine, obviously, but then you have the conflict of Russia with Europe and Russia with NATO and by extension, the United States. And that, I think, really is an essential understanding of this conflict. And so I'm grateful to Michael for putting it all together into book form. The consequences that he points out, too, I think stand up very well. As any book author knows, it's hard when you're doing a book because the book closes a long time before it actually is in people's hands. And so I was preparing for this, looking again at page 232 and looking at the conclusions, and I found myself, still nodding along as I read them. You have 4 conclusions here, Michael. The way this war has solidified Ukraine's Western orientation. The second, that the war is not going to be a short one, which I think sadly is accurate. The third is the significance for China of what's happening, and it's in its relationship with Russia, and the way that this war has, as you put it, ensured that the U.S. will continue to play a uniquely large role in Europe. And I think all that still stands up very, very well. So I think these are all important themes, and look forward to discussing them with you today.
Thank you very much, Mary. And also to this point of collisions, Michael, maybe you can walk our audiences through those collisions. And my questions in particular, if there wasn't one of the collisions, do you think the war would not have happened, or would it have been a different war?
I do think, and I'm grateful to Mary for outlining the three most pertinent collisions: Russia-Ukraine, of course, Russia-Europe, and Russia-US. I do think that you need all three for the war to exist as it has existed. If this were, in a sense, merely a war of territorial adjustment of a few places in the Donbass, I don't think it would, sort of command the attention that it does from any of the major actors. And in some respects, rushing the argument a little bit ahead, one of the reasons it's going to be a long war and a very difficult war to unwind is that it does have these multiple dimensions. It's difficult enough for Russia and Ukraine to come to some kind of agreement on how to end the war. It's different in a different sense for Europe to come to that sort of agreement, and the United States has its own calculations and interests in mind. So the diplomatic variables at work here are unbelievably complicated. Briefly, to sort of sketch each of the points, Russia-Ukraine takes us deep back into history. And here the story of the Soviet Union is very important, but also there's a pre-Soviet history going back to the 17th century, 1654, that links Ukraine and Russia often in ways that are traumatic and connected to the story of empire. And that's, I think, a fundamental and necessary framing. We could also look at the story of Ukrainian statehood, which takes us back in some ways to the medieval period, but also to the 19th century, 1918, and to the First World War, but very importantly to 1991. To the kind of state that Ukraine has built is also integral to the reasons that Ukraine is fighting. Russia-Europe is not less central, really, because the entire story begins in the fall of 2013, when Viktor Yanukovych, then Ukraine's president, refuses to sign an association agreement with the European Union. Not to belabor the details of that very complicated event, it's just to foreground the importance of Europe at that moment, because that sparks a revolution in Ukraine, and in turn, that revolution leads to war between Ukraine and Russia. But also the U.S. component is extremely significant. The United States is the major military benefactor of Ukraine. You've had delayed aid over the last 6-7 months. It's sort of back again recently. But if you look over the last 2.5 years, last 3 years, the U.S. has been really integral to Ukraine's security. And the United States looms very large, as we all know, in Russia's rhetoric about the war with the collective West, as if Ukraine is a kind of shell, Europe is another shell, but behind these two shells is this thing, the United States, that Russia is doing business with or doing battle with. So all of these merge together in highly complicated ways. I do think that merger is, to go back to your question, Maria, necessary for the war to break out. And it's very necessary for those of us working on the diplomatic angle of the end phase, or where to take this, an end game, a kind of strategic posture toward the war. It's very important for us to factor in these three multiple layers.
Thank you very much, Michael. And your book, as you pointed out, right, it flags and particularly how 2013-14 is when the real dynamic unravels. Mary, this is where I wanted to bring you back here. From your perspective, as also historian of NATO expansion, do you agree with this time frame, or would you say that it's exactly where the maybe perhaps certain unraveling of the events made them go in a particular direction, or perhaps would you say there were certain paths taken before that also were extremely consequential for where we ended up? In general, it would be great to get your take on Michael's characteristics of NATO expansion as perhaps being read different from conventional approaches to that. Sound?
Thank you. My apologies. Clearly, I'm getting out of practice. Actually, Michael, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about this concept of the multiple layered war, because obviously, as you said, you've got the actual war versus Russia and Ukraine, and then you've got a conflict with Europe, you've got a conflict with the US and NATO. I wanted to bring in a concept from Michael Kaufman, the idea that what we're witnessing are the wars of Soviet succession. And the reason I want to bring that in is I like what you said very much about if this were a war of territorial adjustment, which is an interesting concept, then it might not have the same kind of global impact that it's having. It seems that there's more to it at stake. And Serhiy Plokhy has also argued, as you know, that even though the Soviet Union collapsed on paper in a day, in reality, empires don't collapse in a day. Empires die long, protracted, messy deaths. And so taking these ideas from Serhiy and Michael Kaufman, I think they fit very well with yours, as seeing this conflict as about a lot more than territory, really about the concept of dominance, post-Cold War dominance still. I mean, obviously we're many, many years past the Berlin Wall coming down and the Soviet Union collapsing. My students, many of them weren't even alive when that happened. And yet those events cast a very, very long shadow over what's happening now. So that, Maria, comes back to your question, which is that I think in order to understand what's happening now, we really do need to understand the end of the Cold War, beginning of the post-Cold War period. I often, with my students, use a theory from Alexander George, the theory of the operational code. The idea being that world leaders, who are generally men, form their view of the world, form their view of how to operate within it. In other words, form their operational code when they are younger, so in their 20s and 30s. Then when they come into power, generally later in life, 50s, 60s, 70s, they then follow that operational code. So in order to understand Putin, I think it's important to understand that his operational code emerges from the Cold War, from his experiences in not just in the KGB, but also serving in East Germany as it was collapsing. And even though those were many decades ago, as far as I can tell, in the mind of Vladimir Putin, they happened yesterday. And so he is very much driven by writing what he sees as the wrongs of those periods. Of course, there's his famous remarks about what a catastrophe it was that the Soviet Union collapsed. And so that long historical shadow And his efforts to rewrite history are what I think makes this more than a war of territorial adjustment, and makes to answer your question, Maria, makes a longer time period essential. It makes it essential to understand a longer time period.
Mm-hmm. Well, I, for one, could not agree more, since my work recently has explored the legacy of nomenclatura, the Soviet ruling elite in power, and how that affects the way they view the world, and why this vision of the world, Michael, right, colludes with the way the West sees the world. And this is, by the way, Michael, where I wanted to ask you, since you do point out in parts of your book, when you talk about Russia, Putin in detail, that the West should have taken Putin's concerns more seriously than it did, right? Like, please correct me if I misinterpreted it. Could you perhaps walk us through, and also connecting perhaps this analysis to what Mary pointed out, right? That this is the man, I don't know if that's a sick man of Europe, or he's just a man who was shaped and formed during a very different time, and so he sees the world quite different. Is that indeed right, that we kind of did not pay enough attention here in the West to like the sort of dangers he really represented?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is an emphatic yes. By taking Putin's concerns more seriously, I think the critique is correct. I wouldn't wish to imply that Putin's concerns should have been accommodated more. If anything, they were probably accommodated too much since 2014 and before. Here there are torturous questions of evidence. We don't know when Putin decided to invade Ukraine in the manner that he did in 2022. Some people argue it's the eve of, and some people see this as implicit to Putinism from 2000, when Putin came to power. The answer is obviously somewhere in between, but we simply don't know. So it's hard to know what we misread in that regard. We don't even know that.
We don't get to read Putin's mind, Elise.
No, it's
even if we try. A lot of people do try.
it's a conundrum of the subject, and it's easy to chase your analytical tail in this regard. But I do think that we can say, with the benefit of hindsight, that two things were missed, and the price paid for missing these two things has been exceedingly high. And the first is a pattern which runs from perhaps 2007, the Munich Security Speech, to the invasion of Georgia, 2008, to annexation of Crimea, incursion into eastern Ukraine in 2014, move into Syria in 2015, the interference in the US election in 2016. And then, of course, this points in the direction of what happened in 2022. And I think it was hard for many, and I have empathy for this, but it was hard for many to see the continuum in this pattern, and to see that each was, in a sense, a step in a sort of more and more ambitious direction. We used the metaphor when I worked in the State Department, 2014 to 2016, of an off-ramp, as if there was a single discrete decision that Putin could take and this whole situation would just go away. That wasn't the correct metaphor. Putin was moving towards something, and I think we had great difficulty seeing what that was. Second point is a version, in a way, of the first, and takes us more directly to Putin. And I think it's a good debate about Putin, whether he changed or not. In my view, I think he did. But he does have an increasing appetite for risk, or he gives himself the tools to act on the kinds of ambitions that he may have had all along. I don't think that he went crazy during the pandemic, as some allege, but I do think there's a kind of growing self-confidence on Putin's part after the annexation of Crimea, bordering on hubris, and his appetite for risk, I think, is something that we all understood very poorly. And if you go back to the year 2021, when people were trying to figure out, will Putin invade or won't he, it was just very, very hard to see that his appetite for risk had gone to the point where he was perfectly willing to invade, and that was missed. And it's very difficult to get those things right in real time, but we do have to acknowledge the mistakes that were made, and that was a big one.
This is a very important point. Thank you, Michael. And we'll get back to this in general, the escalatory nature of this conflict in a little bit. Before that, though, I wanted, Mary, also turn back to you. So also, obviously, you have looked at the great debate around NATO expansion in your book, Not 1 Inch. Could you perhaps walk us through the main argument, and how would that argument kind of collide or maybe reinforce reinforce Michael's point, given that obviously a lot of analysts are blaming still everything that's happened on NATO expansion. So what is your take, and how does Michael's book fit in your broad argument?
Yeah, Michael, let me once again respond to Maria by picking up on something you said that I want to foot stomp, which is missing a pattern. You mentioned a pattern going from 2007 in Munich to 2008 in Georgia, 2014 Ukraine, 2015 Syria, 2016 election interference. I second that. I also, and this gets to Maria's question about my book, I also, as you know, saw a pattern as well in my research. As many of you know, my research is based largely on documents that I got declassified. And in working with those documents, I also saw a pattern. I'm not the only one, but perhaps because I just had so many documents, it just really jumped out at me. A pattern of Putin celebrating historically significant dates with violence. So, for example, to add to the dates that you've already had there, Michael, the extremely brave journalist and human rights activist Anna Politkovskaya, one of the few people willing to report firsthand on war crimes being committed at Putin's order in Chechnya, which sadly we know now are precursors to Mariupol and so forth. Anna Politkovskaya, a middle-aged woman carrying home groceries to her apartment one day in Moscow, shot dead, shot multiple times at close range, almost certainly by a professional killer, on October 7th, 2006, Putin's birthday, right? And then Putin mentioned this in a speech, referred to her as an extremely insignificant person. Fast forward 10 years, you have the drop of the emails hacked from the Hillary Clinton campaign on October 7th, 2016, Putin's birthday. Last year, in 2022, for his 70th birthday, Putin basically, just before that, announced that he was annexing large parts of Ukraine, which the Russian military did not at that time and still does not control. So he basically tried to give himself many, many tens of thousands of square kilometers of Ukraine as a birthday present.
Talk about nice birthday
gifts. Although I have absolutely, this is 100% speculation on my part, so I have no evidence in this in contrast to my book. I wonder if the Russia-Iran axis is now so tight that Putin was able to influence the go date of the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th.
Yeah.
So there's this clear pattern of Putin using, as I said, violence to celebrate in a gruesome way, not only his birthday, but also important Soviet dates. The hacking of the US presidential campaign happened in 2016, the 25th anniversary of Soviet collapse. And so coming back to your question, Maria, about my book, I had been researching my book for a long time. It takes a long time to get documents declassified. I had previously did books on the Berlin Wall coming down and on German unification. And in the course of that, I stumbled across documents on NATO enlargement, which is the name, Maria, that supporters of NATO enlargement prefer to NATO expansion. Mm-hmm. And I came across these documents and I thought, this is an interesting topic. I would like to do a book about this, but I really want to write the book only when I have enough evidence. So I basically, in the background of working on other books, just kept filing declassification requests. And finally I started really in 2005, and it took over 10 years to get enough documents. But I mean, fortunately, as a professor, I was tenured, I had time. And I had a big breakthrough in 2018 when I got all of the Clinton-Yeltsin summits declassified, the briefing books in advance, the protocols of the summits themselves, the after-action reports. That took a 3-year process, a 3-year appeal with the Clinton Library, but I got them declassified. And interesting note, when I got them declassified in summer 2018, the Kremlin complained. So Dmitry Peskov issued a complaint, was reported on, saying that the Clinton Library should not have released these materials. So I figured, well, if the Kremlin is complaining, the material must be good.
Yeah.
And it was. So to come back to your question, Maria, so the next question for me was, now, okay, I finally have enough. I've been getting documents classified for over a decade. I finally have enough. When am I actually going to publish this book? And so keeping in mind the pattern that Michael laid out and that I extended, I looked at the calendar. So it's now, once I got through those documents, it's now, 2019. And I saw that 2021 would be the 30th anniversary of Ukraine splitting away and the 30th anniversary of Ukraine splitting away and the 30th anniversary of Soviet collapse. Now, I wasn't psychic. I didn't know he was going to try to take Kyiv in 3 days. But I knew Putin would be unable to ignore that anniversary. And I decided to publish the book in December 2021 in the US and February 2022 in the UK, because I just had this awful feeling that something terrible was going to happen because of the pattern. And Maria, as you said, because of this long-standing tension over NATO enlargement and the friction over, potential that NATO might expand to Ukraine, I just had this awful, awful feeling that something terrible was going to happen. So that was the reason I published that book. And this all comes back to Michael's point, which is the importance of recognizing patterns in history, which is something I think historians do well. Obviously, Michael obviously is the rare person who's both a serious historian and actually served in the State Department. But normally historians don't have security clearances, so we aren't very good on day-to-day information. But we are very good at, deep history pattern recognition. And I think that deserves more recognition. And that also is one of the strengths of Michael's book.
This is fascinating, Mary. Thank you very much. And especially the whole October 7 part is extremely concerning to our audiences. And note, plan accordingly your next vacation, especially if it happens to be around October. Michael, do you have to comment on that? Did you also notice very important patterns in Putin's behavior, perhaps, or maybe same comes to be said about the West, which are worth pointing out for us if we wanted to make better sense of this unraveling dynamic?
Well, I had not seen any of this pattern that Mary just laid out with the dates, which is utterly fascinating, and certainly worth very, very careful consideration for what it might portend about the future. When it comes to Putin, I can only say this in terms of a pattern. I don't think that he gives up on things, and I don't think that he moderates, or at the very least, I can't think of many examples. I guess in Syria, things have largely gone Russia's way, but there hasn't been a deep pattern there of intensification. But when you go back to 2014, 2015, and here you ask about the West, Maria, it's sort of another mistake that we made, I think, in part, I'll put it very bluntly, because Europe and the United States wanted to sweep the whole issue under the carpet and be done with it and sort of put Ukraine in the past tense and move on to issues related to China and to geopolitics elsewhere. But it was foolish then to assume, as I think most of us did, that the very provisional solutions that were offered in 2014, 2015, known as Minsk diplomacy, that these were really solutions to the problem. It would have been wiser, and again, hindsight helps with this, but it would have been wiser to assume that Putin was biding his time, that he would look for other options to get what he clearly wanted, which was some form of control, at the very least, over Ukrainian foreign policy, if not over Ukrainian politics writ large, and that Putin has a tendency, and maybe this goes back to some of what Mary was saying a moment ago with Anna Politkovskaya, I don't think he struck immediately when she annoyed him, but he waited and, the moment came and he struck. I think of all people, Yevgeny Prigozhin should have known about this pattern because he works for the man, and maybe he did, and maybe he was just a fatalist, but I think there too, it's not as if Prigozhin was immediately executed. After his mutiny, it took a few months, and then the action came. So if we expect in the future, I think here's the policy relevant aspect of this, Putin to moderate on Ukraine, I would certainly be very surprised. And I think the more reasonable expectation is that he may allow a certain amount of ebb and flow in the Russian war effort, but is likely to escalate in some form in the future until when and if he gets what he wants. And if you fit that into the pattern of dates that Mary is talking about, perhaps one could come up with an even more precise analysis of this pattern. We don't have evidence, but Putin has been in power now for 24 years almost, and that does allow us, I think, to speak carefully and with a degree of accuracy about these kinds of patterns.
So that essentially brings some very problematic conclusions, right? That if he constantly escalates and he doesn't really moderate a lot, and he also has this obsession with dates, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to get out of this conflict very easily. That's what it sounds like, right, from the discussion here. You point out, Michael, that the difference between this unraveling dynamic crisis between the West and Russia, as opposed to the Cold War period, is it's much more escalatory in its nature. If I got your point correctly, could you please elaborate on that a little bit? Perhaps it fits what you just said. Yeah.
Well, would love to hear Mary's thoughts on exactly this question because she's written so many extraordinary books, not just not one inch, but many extraordinary books about the end phase of the Cold War and the beginning of our era. Now, to be sure, the Cold War, if you look at it globally, was unbelievably violent. Millions upon millions of lives lost, and there were many hot wars within the Cold War. Some of which the U.S. was involved in, Vietnam, Korea, and some that were sort of Soviet projects, Afghanistan, and many that drew both the Soviet Union and the U.S. in different ways. There was lots of concern over the city of Berlin. There's the Berlin airlift in 1948. There are multiple Berlin crises in the 1950s and early 60s, and it would be wrong to describe the Cold War as an especially stable period or one in which armed conflict was somehow peripheral or just on the margins. But I do think that there are a few differences between then and the present moment, and I'll sort of spell them out really for Mary's consideration. The first is that after 1945, despite the many tensions and two Soviet invasions of Eastern and Central Europe, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the Cold War was not directly fought in Europe itself. So Europe was perhaps the cause of the Cold War, but it was not the central battleground. That at the moment is no longer the case.
Unfortunately, yeah.
In addition, I think the ways in which the U.S. has been involved and European countries have been involved in the current Ukraine war, to me, seems different from the Cold War. Sometimes the current war is described as a proxy war. It seems to me more just like a war. It's not as if the United States is pretending not to be sending weapons to Ukraine. To the contrary, this is a very public and overt things. And of course, those weapons are being used to kill Russian soldiers. So that's a step beyond where we were, I think, in the Cold War. And on the Russian side, not only has Russia invaded in the most brazen way a major European country, but Russia has indulged in a kind of loose nuclear rhetoric that I don't recall any Soviet leader sanctioning during the Cold War. So the conflict is in Europe, which means that it's going to have the repercussions that European conflicts often do. The conflict is more fluid, more direct, more immediate than any of the Cold War conflicts I can think of. And the nuclear dimension is there in ways that are very difficult to assess, but are more, sort of chaotic and anarchic, rhetorically at least, than was the case in the Cold War. That puts us all, I'm afraid, in a new world and in one that seems unbelievably dangerous to me. Not to downplay the dangers of the Cold War, but I think ours may be a touch worse.
That's excellent analysis, Michael. Mary, could I, as Michael suggested, get your perspective on this analysis, these points?
Yeah, Michael, I'd be interested in your view. I still struggle myself with whether to label what we are experiencing, the new Cold War, Cold War II. I know there's a number of people arguing very clearly that it is. Neil Ferguson has been arguing that for a long time, actually, with regard to China. Dmitry Alperovich has a book coming out where he's talking about Cold War II. A couple other people do as well. I guess, as a historian, we always like to say, well, it's the same, but also different, right? Which is what, what frustrates policymakers who would like some clear answers. I agree with you that what is going on has many differences to the Cold War. And one difference of many is the role and weight of China and India. For example, I actually just used the New York Times special On the Brink, which is the editorial page has been doing an extended investigation into the chance of nuclear war today. Definitely raises the hair on the back of my neck and is an uncomfortable repetition of things I remember as a kid growing up in the Cold War, seeing the film The Day After and worrying about whether the war would end in thermonuclear conflict before I got to go to college. And I was struck in using this with students. We went through it. The New York Times is reporting that Putin, after the fall of Kherson, came very close to using tactical nuclear weapons in response. Now, I have no independent way of verifying this, so I'm just reporting what was in the New York Times article. But apparently, China and India leaned heavily on Putin not to use tactical nuclear weapons. And that suggests to me, ways in which this conflict really is different from the Cold War. I think it is very dangerous, and you're absolutely right, Michael. The phrase Cold War is kind of a misnomer because, many people died in what we usually refer to as proxy conflicts. But I think there's even more complexity going on now, in particular because of the roles of China and India. If this is accurate, then I think it is very fortunate that China and India pressured Putin to step back from the decision, or step back from the inclination to use tactical nuclear weapons. And it highlights that there are, in fact, major differences. But obviously, if you have the similarity of Washington and Moscow being in a nuclear standoff, obviously is very much like the Cold War. So I'm still struggling myself with whether to call this a new Cold War. I actually am interested in Michael and Maria, whether you guys feel comfortable using that phrase or not.
Yeah, Michael, what do you think? Thank you very much, Mary.
I would avoid it. I think, Mary, you touched on the key reason. For me, the global dynamics seem very different. I wouldn't say that the current situation is without an ideological framing. Certainly for the Biden White House, democracy is a very important part of the war in Ukraine. And today's Russia has a number of its own ideological framings for the war. Those seem to me, sort of less coherent, in a way less profound maybe than some of the ideological differences of the old Cold War. Maybe there's an irony of the current war, the current set of conditions, which is that neither the United States nor Russia is quite what these two powers were, in the case of Russia, the Soviet Union, during the Cold War. The United States has been shocked that it cannot mobilize the in-between countries, the non-aligned countries in this conflict, the Indias, the Brazils, the South Africas, really a huge mass of countries that just don't wish to sanction Russia or get directly involved.
But is that different? I mean, they were non-aligned during the Cold War, too.
Well, that's true. But I think, you just sort of see the limits of U.S. power in that regard. And Russia, which is global in a number of ways today, is far less globally present than the Soviet Union was. The geometry just feels different. Of course, the nuclear dimension is fundamentally similar. It imposes constraints on both Moscow and Washington. This kind of contest over influence, territory, ideas is, of course, vaguely similar as well. And I think some of the strategic thinking at the present moment is going to bear maybe a lot of similarity to the Cold War. So there, I'm sort of comfortable with the strategic traditions and legacies of the Cold War. I feel like they're very applicable in ways that we could discuss. But somehow, Cold War as such just doesn't seem perfect. And thinking about students and the general public, a kind of Cold War 2.0 has a lot of potential to mislead. And so it's almost for that purpose that I would want to get away from it. Not that it isn't helpful, but it's maybe not helpful enough.
I wanted to jump in with my own 2 cents here, since honestly, my own analysis of Russian system and the remarkable degree of this nomenclatura, the Soviet ruling elite's continuity on top of Russian power, actually makes me question the assumption that the Cold War ever ended in the first place, given that it's often the same people use the revolution of the so-called revolution of second secretaries, where it's same nomenclature over from the lower ranks, but certainly the ones that the groups that preserve the same worldview, the same animosity against the West, the implicit, almost like, biological assumption that the West is the enemy, and also this claim over the neighboring territories, that actually makes me question to what extent, maybe we're a little bit too quick to conclude that the Cold War was over. What was over was just the system, which constrained the leadership, because Soviet Union was much more institutionalized. Right now, it's more scary. It's scary partly because Putin is completely unconstrained by anything inside of Russia, almost. Michael.
And just to enhance that point, and perhaps to contradict myself, a huge number of Biden staffers now worked for something called the Truman Project, or were affiliated with something called the Truman Project before their formal careers in foreign policy, which would suggest a very important connection back to the early days of the Cold War. And of course, President Biden himself, his primary education in foreign affairs is an education in the Cold War. So not just on the Russian side, but also on the U.S. side, there are these echoes that are very audible.
And can help but mention the studies that consistently show the continuity in beliefs and really fundamental effect of this formative period in operational codes, Mary, as you mentioned, on beliefs in both sides, in both American and Russian elites. Yeah.
Biden. The point about Biden, Michael, is very well taken. I had the welcome opportunity to attend a talk by John Meacham, who is close with President Biden. President Biden apparently reaches out to him regularly for historical advice for big speeches, which I can only endorse. And so I heard John Meacham speaking about the process of interacting with Biden, and Meacham talked about how much 20th century political history matters to Biden, which, makes complete sense given that he lived through and participated in much of that history. So if we're talking about world leaders who still very much have the Cold War in their heads, Biden is also very much one of them. So even though for my students, these events are ancient history, they are still shaping today's world. And so it's advertisement here for history classes. It's important to understand this history. And not just because I think it's interesting, but because it actually is shaping the thinking of policymakers, shaping their framing of the conflicts today.
And shall I mention that if they believe 20th century history is so important to them, then they certainly should read Michael's book, which talks precisely about that, and also Mary Sarotte's excellent work, which takes us to, and I want to be cognizant of our time, to the issue of the blinders, right? The mental blinders, the biases that are conditioning our vision of the world. Michael, especially in the end, in the conclusion, you make this excellent analysis of some of the mistakes or the pre-war assumptions, rather, that have been proven wrong. You already discussed them a little bit earlier during this conversation, that peace in Europe was a given, that Europe actually was able to manage its own affairs, and of course that Russia could be easily or casually integrated into Europe. Could you walk us through those? Why do you think those are no longer true? And also perhaps there are other mistakes or perhaps wrong assumptions that we made, which was subsequently rejected. And Mary, I will turn to you then with the same question.
I very much appreciate the question. I think it's going to be difficult for historians of the future to understand something that I think came very naturally to me and perhaps to both of you in the 1990s and thereafter, which was our optimism.
Yeah.
That there was an extraordinary burst of optimism with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Mary, you've written the book on that topic. And that's something that I myself came of age with, and I think was just part of our outlook. And Europe was the focal point of this optimism, a place of integration where walls were coming down, borders were opening up. And Europe itself was this engine or motor of peace, as many Europeans understood it, and many in the US understood as well. Now, that was true in many significant ways, but it wasn't universally or forever true. And I think that we all had difficulty, if I can speak collectively, we all had difficulty seeing beyond that optimism. In that sense, 2013, 2014 comes as such a shock, the annexation of Crimea, incursion into the Donbass, and to 2022, despite the excellence of U.S. intelligence and how well the Biden White House communicated all of that, still I think February 2022 comes as a huge shock. And that is to be explained by the optimism that we had and some of the blinders that optimism imposed. Now, I had very much hoped that Russia could be integrated in some way into a kind of broader European family or a broader transatlantic family. And I don't think that this was something that never happened. There are lots of pieces and parts of this that were true, but one does have to accept in retrospect that this was probably not really Putin's project, even in 2000, although it could look that way for a while. It could look that way certainly with Dmitry Medvedev, but I don't think that he was in charge. Instead, Putin was doing something that's very traditional for Russian history. He was modernizing, integrating for the sake of improving Russia's geopolitical position as he understood it, which is just something very different from integration. That goes back to some of the patterns that we were talking about earlier. And it's not that this was invisible, but it wasn't as clearly perceived as it could have been. The final point I'll make about blinders is a bit more geographic, but also very historically inflected. And I'll tack onto this a certain point about how we can look at the future. One of the strangest things about the period from 1991 to, let's say, 2022 is that for a geographical part of Europe that has been unbelievably prone to conflict, to many different wars, the historian Timothy Snyder has called it the bloodlands. This is Ukraine, but Eastern and Central Europe in a broader sense. It's very strange that we didn't think about the potential for war there because it's just so embedded in the history of the region. There are two dilemmas for Eastern and Central Europe. One is that Europe doesn't know where it ends. Nobody knows where Europe comes to an end. Maybe it's the Ural Mountains, maybe it's the Rhine River, maybe it's somewhere in between, and nobody knows where Russia ends. There are billboards in Moscow that suggest that Russia has no borders. It sort of goes on.
So historically, deeply debated philosophical question in Russia.
Yeah, it goes on forever. It's a philosophical question. It's a cultural question. It's a geographic question, but it's very much a geopolitical question as well. And those two ambiguities, not knowing where Europe ends and not knowing where Russia ends, are the cause of war. So we should have been more canny about that. We should have been more sober about that. And so going forward in the future, the sort of last point that I'll make is that we can't wish this problem away. It's going to be with us for the next 100 years, maybe for the next 500 years. It's certainly been with us for the last 300 years, this sort of Europe-Russia point. But there are better and worse ways of managing that divide and of discovering that border and figuring out a way to live with it and to deal with it. We're at the very beginning stages of that, but I have a degree of optimism that we can do it, but we have to be very, very sober about the stakes, how difficult it is, and how embedded some of these regional tensions are.
Thank you, Michael. I'll add to that the last 2 years, honestly, to me personally, also were extremely revealing. It also helps to understand how Russia's 20th century in many, like, for example, societal responses, right, given the last 2 years, this tendency to acquiesce with the authorities, but also tendency, like, to double down on these decisions, etc., etc. A lot of those questions that we've had before kind of were answered. Unfortunately, perhaps not the answers we wanted to receive, but answers nonetheless. Mary, do you have to add to that? What were the biases, maybe perhaps, and certain assumptions that we had before the war that were perhaps rejected now and we should be aware of going forward?
Well, let me pick up on what Michael was saying. Let me agree with one aspect and disagree with one aspect on disagreement. So, Michael, and I like the framing. It's thought-provoking. We don't know where Europe ends, and we don't know where Russia ends. The question is, who are we? I think the Ukrainian front line knows where Russia ends, and I would like to express my admiration, profound admiration, for the bravery of the Ukrainians and the way that they have resisted the full-scale invasion of their country. I think, though, on the other hand, you're right, this idea of we don't know where Russia ends is useful to Putin and to Russians who are in support of the conflict. And clearly they feel that, for example, parts of what we in the West recognize as Ukraine should be part of Russia. So I think that's an interesting framing, but I would want to know exactly who we is in that sentence. On agreement, I think you're absolutely right, Michael, to identify the big question as the one about the optimism of the post-Cold War period. And Maria, this gets to your question about, what assumptions were in place. Was that optimism unmerited, unjustified, delusional? I personally believe there was a genuine thaw, and there were genuinely possibilities for a better outcome in the period between the end of the Cold War and the start of COVID. I believe between the Cold War and COVID, we had a genuine moment and the optimism was justified. I also, just to be clear, because when I give talks, I get asked about this, I also am a supporter of NATO enlargement. I am glad that it happened. My problem is not with enlargement itself. My problem is with how it happened, as anyone who's read my book knows. And I think the way that it happened created unnecessary issues and problems in the relationship with Russia. Now, to be clear, ultimately, and Maria, you would know better than I would, ultimately what happens in Russia is, above all else, the responsibility of the Russians. So I personally don't blame NATO for what happened in Russia. I do think, however, we need to be clear-eyed about the way that the possibilities inherent in the post-Cold War moment of optimism eroded. And I think that is really going to be the task of historians, to look at what I believe was a genuine thaw and look at how it slipped away, how the possibilities inherent in that moment slipped away. Michael, I'd be interested to know what your view is, because I know there are a lot of people out there. I was recently at the Munich Security Conference. I did an event with the Prime Minister of Estonia, who basically said to me, that's nonsense. There were never any real possibilities for cooperation. You're kidding yourself. And, and I pushed back against her, but it was clear that this was the debate. And it's exactly what you said, Michael, is, the optimism of the post-Cold War moment. I'd be interested in your take on whether that optimism was, in fact, justified.
Thank you, Mary. Michael.
I think the optimism was very much justified. And one of the things I've tried to do in the book is not to be too deterministic about what happened in 2022. And that's why I begin the book not in Munich with the security conference speech, which almost tells the story in and of itself. I begin in 2008 with President Obama's election, with Dmitry Medvedev coming into the Kremlin, precisely because that seems a moment, and I genuinely believe this, when nothing was predetermined. There was no inevitable war between Russia and Ukraine at that point, and certainly no inevitable set of acute conflicts between Russia and Europe and Russia and the United States. I would also emphasize, it's not quite an answer to your question, Mary, but I'll just sort of throw the point out there because I know that we both struggle with this question, or we embrace this question as historians. There's a lot of contingency in this narrative. And to me, it's a little bit like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914, which is the contingency of contingencies when it comes to European history. But it's the flight of Viktor Yanukovych in the third week of February 2014. If he doesn't do that, if he had stayed around for there to be an election, as people had agreed to in Ukraine in December of 2014, maybe none of this would have happened. Improbable, perhaps, but it's a necessary contingency. So if we acknowledge a role for contingency, in a sense, we have to acknowledge the legitimacy retrospectively of the optimism people had that these were soluble problems and that we could have moved past all of the Cold War conflicts that seemed to come to an end in 1991. I did want to circle back for a moment to your question of who the we is, because I think it's really fundamental. I think it's a mistake to say we is the omniscient narrator, because there is no omniscient narrator. Let's say we, the West, Ukraine, Europe, the United States. I think we do know. This is the dilemma, as I understand it. We do know where Europe ends, so we do know where Russia begins, or perhaps we know. For us, it's Ukraine is completely in Europe, and it deserves its territorial integrity and sovereignty. And probably the same obtains for Belarus, at least in most official circles, that it's not Russia, it's Europe. But the question is, can we enforce this? And can we really bring Crimea formally back into Europe? Can we bring Ukraine at all into NATO, into the European Union? That's, sort of an open set of questions. And I share your admiration for the soldiers of Ukraine, but that very line that Ukrainians see as the place where Ukraine is and where Russia should not be, or where Russia ends, that very line is moving day by day, and we don't know where it's gonna where it's gonna end up. So there, to me, is sort of the ambiguities that get built in. And as to where Russia sees the end, I think it's probably a very high degree of ambition at the moment in Moscow that they can push that border very, very far to the west, not to
and
Berlin.
Actually, just one more comment, which
of course.
Unfortunately we're not going to have time to discuss at length, but this also raises an older question, which was one you and I know well, which is the German question, right? Which is, where does Germany end?
Absolutely.
Right? And as you know, I have proposed a West German model for Ukraine membership, meaning you establish a militarily defensible front line, which you explicitly identify as temporary, and then you bind the western part to the West. And my hope, obviously, my wish is that Ukraine could have its borders from 1991 back. But if, realistically where we are now, I think if we could at least establish a new militarily defensible and temporary, that's the emphasis, front line, that then Ukraine could be West Germany of the 21st century.
Just very quickly to add my strong agreement with that, we have to solve these two problems simultaneously. The security problem and also the definitional problem of what Europe is and where it lies. We can't do one and not the other. We have to do both at the same time.
This is really a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, Michael and Mary. And I want to flag that obviously it's just the very start, what looks like quite a really concerning, but not the less absolutely imminent and extremely important conversation. Obviously, we're nowhere near from the end of this problem unraveling. And let's hope that the West, to quote Michael, some of your book's conclusion, will stop over-promising and under-delivering going forward, partly when informed by the work of our two great guests here. Unfortunately, for our audiences, we're out of time. That's all we've got time for today. I'm going to leave it here. I want to thank Michael Kimmage and Mary Sarotte again for joining us today in fantastic, very in-depth conversation, even if extremely concerning. I am, for one, certainly not going to be sleeping very well after this, but we certainly should be aware of where this all is going. Another thank you for our viewers for tuning in. If you like the conversations like this, please be sure to check out our podcast, Russian Roulette, subscribe, and give us a 5-star rating. And plus, also check out our sister podcast, The Europhile, wherever you get your podcasts. Lastly, if you haven't already, please order a copy of Michael's book, The Collisions, The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability, out now from Oxford University Press. You can find it on Oxford's website or our event page as well. Thank you again, and see you next time. You've been listening to Russian Roulette. We hope you enjoyed this episode and tune in again soon.
Russian Roulette releases new episodes every 2 weeks on Thursdays and is available wherever you get your podcasts. So please subscribe and share our episodes online.
And be sure to check out all the latest analysis by the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at csis.org.